The air itself was thick with a choking fog that was not fog at all but gunpowder smoke, heavy with the smell of torn earth and things much worse, a smell that clung to the back of your throat and lived in your clothes, a constant reminder of the 3 days of hell that had just exploded over the peaceful farmlands of Gettysburg, where the very sounds of summer, the buzz of insects, the whisper of wind through wheat, had been utterly erased, replaced by an unending, ear-splitting roar of cannon fire so intense it vibrated in your teeth, the screams of horses, and the desperate shouts of men fighting and dying in a storm of lead that cut down wheat and men with the same cruel indifference, a battle that had now, finally, blessedly, stopped, leaving behind a silence that was not silent at all but filled with a low, haunting chorus of agony from thousands of wounded men scattered across the broken landscape, calling for water, for help, for their mothers, under a sky that was finally beginning to clear, showing the first stars of evening like cold, distant diamonds watching over the awful scene below. It was in this half-light, as the smoke slowly began to drift and settle like a shroud over the fields, that a young Union private named Samuel Weaver stumbled slowly, his body moving on pure instinct alone, every muscle screaming in protest, his mind numb and blank, unable to process the scale of the horror he had just lived through, his uniform crusted with a foul mixture of mud, sweat, and dark, dried stains that were not mud. His face a hollow mask of exhaustion, driven now by one simple, primal need that overrode all else, a thirst so powerful his tongue felt like a piece of leather stuck to the roof of his mouth, his throat raw and burning, his empty canteen a heavy, mocking weight on his hip, forcing him to scan the terrible ground around him, not looking at the faces of the fallen, both blue and gray, trying to see them only as shapes, as objects, because to see them as men, as boys like himself, was a thought too heavy to carry, so he kept his eyes down, searching for the glint of a metal canteen, a full one, any one that might still hold a few precious drops of warm, metallic-tasting water that would feel like a miracle. He was near the famous copse of trees, the ground here churned into a bloody bog by thousands of boots and hooves and the impact of countless shells, a place of such concentrated death that it was hard to breathe, and as he took a careful step over a still form, his worn boot scuffed against something solid partly buried in the churned-up soil near a shattered fence post, not a body, but a sturdy, ornate box made of dark wood, about the size of a large loaf of bread, its surface scarred and splintered by a passing bullet or piece of shrapnel, one of its iron hinges twisted and broken. He paused, his thirst forgotten for a moment, a flicker of normal human curiosity piercing his numb exhaustion, and he knelt down, the wet mud soaking through the knee of his trousers, and with fingers that were stiff and sore, he managed to pry open the damaged lid, which creaked in protest, revealing not military supplies, but a small, heartbreakingly neat collection of a life now almost certainly ended. A carefully folded officer's frock coat of fine gray wool, a leather-bound journal with a simple strap holding it closed, a small, elegant daguerreotype in a brass frame showing a beautiful, serious-faced woman with kind eyes, and beside it, a thick, rectangular packet securely wrapped in waxed oilcloth and tied tightly with cord, keeping whatever was inside safe from the elements. A deep sense of wrongness washed over him, the feeling of intruding on a sacred, private space, but the world had ended, and the rules of before seemed to belong to another universe entirely. A practical thought entered his mind. The journal could hold valuable intelligence for his commanders, or, more importantly, it could be sent back to the man's family, a last piece of him returned. A single act of decency in this sea of madness, and so, making a quick decision, he reached in and took the journal and the heavy, mysterious oilcloth packet, shoving them both deep into his own dirty haversack, the weight of them feeling significant, final. He stood up, leaving the coat and the picture of the woman behind, a sudden urgency to leave this spot now pushing him on, and he took only a few steps before his eyes caught the glint of a canteen nestled in the crook of a fallen soldier's arm. He moved to it, his hand closing around the cool metal, and he shook it, hearing the glorious, sloshing answer of nearly full contents, and he fumbled with the cap, bringing it to his lips and drinking in deep, desperate gulps, the water tasting of tin, and a little of dirt but feeling like life itself flowing into him. And it was in that exact moment of relief, his head tilted back, his eyes closed, that the world ended for a second time as a lone, last artillery shell, fired from a retreating Confederate battery far across the field, screamed out of the darkening sky and impacted the earth exactly where he had just been kneeling beside the box. The explosion was a solid wall of sound and force that hit him from behind, lifting him off his feet as if he were a doll and hurling him forward through the air in a tumbling, helpless arc, his body limp, the half-full canteen flying from his grasp, and he landed with a sickening, bone-jarring crash at the bottom of a steep, rain-cut gully that was already serving as a mass grave for a dozen other men. The back of his head striking a hidden rock with a sharp, final crack, and his world instantly narrowed to a single point of blinding pain before snuffing out into absolute nothingness, just as the concussion from the blast dislodged the soft earth at the gully's edge, triggering a small landslide of soil, rocks, and broken bodies that slid down on top of him, covering him completely in a cold, heavy, suffocating darkness, burying the living Private Samuel Weaver and his secret haversack deep beneath the ashes and tragedy of Gettysburg, leaving no sign that he was there at all. While above, the stars shone down, cold and silent, on the field of the dead, and so he remained, trapped in a cold, silent, and absolute blackness, a prisoner in a tomb of earth and fallen comrades, his consciousness snuffed out but his body clinging stubbornly to a faint, shallow spark of life that flickered deep within him, a fragile ember in the overwhelming void, unaware of the passage of time as hours bled into a day, and a day into another, the world above him moving on, the sounds of battle replaced by the grim, steady sounds of cleanup, the distant, muffled voices of burial details calling to one another, the rough scrape of shovels biting into dirt, the dull thud of earth falling on wood, the occasional heartbreaking sob of a man overcome by the gruesome task, sounds that filtered down to him through layers of soil and bodies as if from 1,000 miles away. Distant echoes of a reality he was no longer a part of. The weight on his chest was immense, a constant, crushing pressure that made each tiny, involuntary breath a monumental struggle, a shallow sip of air that tasted of damp soil, decay, and the iron-rich tang of blood. Yet this very weight, this horrific confinement, also acted as a cruel kind of bandage, applying pressure to wounds he couldn't feel and slowing the seep of blood that would have otherwise drained his life away on the open field. He drifted in a formless, feverish sea of unconsciousness, where dreams and reality swirled together in a terrifying mix. One moment he was a boy back home, feeling the warm sun on his face as he walked through a field of wildflowers. The next he was choking, drowning in a river of cold mud, the smiling face of the woman from the daguerreotype morphing into a screaming skull. The leather-bound journal in his haversack burning with a cold, black fire that spread through his side, a constant, aching cold that was the only real sensation in a body otherwise numb from cold and confinement. Meanwhile, above ground, the monumental effort to reclaim the land continued, a race against disease and decay, as details of men, their faces pale and grim, worked from dawn until dusk, their handkerchiefs soaked in peppermint oil or whiskey tied over their noses, their movements mechanical, their hearts hardened by the endless horror. And it was on the second day of this cleanup that a group of these men, exhausted and emotionally drained, paused at the edge of the gully where Samuel lay, entombed, looking down at the jumbled, pitiful mass of blue and gray uniforms tangled together in the deep ditch, and after a brief, silent consultation, their weary sergeant simply shook his head, deciding that digging out this particular death trap was a task that would take too much time and manpower for too little reward, that the men within were already lost to God, and so they did the practical, terrible thing. They hammered a simple, rough-hewn wooden stake into the ground at the head of the gully, and one of the men, perhaps feeling a need to mark the spot with some small shred of dignity, used a piece of charcoal to scrawl the number 37 on the stake, a cold, anonymous count of the souls they believed were buried there, before moving on to easier, more open ground, leaving the gully and its one living secret to the elements and the scavenging animals that had begun to creep back into the silent fields. The rain came then, a soft, steady drizzle that fell for a full day and night, washing the blood from the grass and turning the earth to slick mud, the water seeping down through the soil, finding its way into Samuel's tiny, airless pocket, a cold trickle that ran across his forehead and into his mouth, a bitter, dirty taste that nonetheless triggered a deep, primal instinct in his shattered brain, and his throat, raw and parched, moved in a feeble, automatic swallow, the moisture providing just enough stimulus to slowly, agonizingly, begin to pull the faint ember of his consciousness back from the brink of utter extinction. It started as a low, throbbing pain in his skull, a dull ache that grew steadily sharper and more focused, pulling him upward from the depths of nothingness, followed by a deep, cold ache in his limbs, a feeling of being pinioned, trapped, and then, finally, a rising tide of pure, unadulterated panic as his mind, still fogged and broken, began to process the simple, horrifying truth that he could not move, he could not see. He could barely breathe, and that he was buried alive beneath the terrible, suffocating weight of the entire world. The panic was a living thing, a wild animal trapped in the cage of his chest, its frantic beating against his ribs the only thing that felt truly alive in the frozen, crushing darkness, a primal terror that screamed at him to thrash, to fight, to scream his way out of this earthly grave, but his body, broken and pinned by the immense, solemn weight of the dead, refused to obey the desperate commands of his mind, leaving him trapped in a horrifying paralysis where all he could do was feel the coarse grit of soil against his cheeks, the cold, clammy press of a wool uniform, whether his or another's, he could not tell, against his face, and the terrifying, constant pressure on his lungs that made each tiny, shallow breath a conscious, agonizing effort, a sip of thick, foul air that tasted of decay and damp earth, and the final, bitter breaths of the men entombed with him. Time had lost all meaning, stretching and contorting in the absolute blackness, measured only by the slow, rhythmic drumbeat of pain in his skull and the gradual, chilling seep of rainwater that continued to trickle down from the world above, each cold drop a tiny, mocking reminder of the life that continued on without him, a life of sun and wind and open skies that he could now only desperately try to remember. Clinging to the fading image of the woman from the photograph, her face becoming a fragile talisman against the overwhelming despair, a single point of light in the infinite black. It was this very water, this slow, soaking dampness, that became his unlikely savior, as the constant moisture began to loosen the densely packed soil directly around his head, creating a minuscule pocket of air, a tiny cavern no larger than his fist, but enough to allow a slightly deeper, less stifled breath. And with that breath came a sliver of clarity, a fragile thread of thought that weaved through the fabric of his panic, telling him to be still, to conserve his energy, to listen, and in the silence, he heard it, not the sounds of men, for they were long gone, but the skittering of a field mouse somewhere in the gully, the faint rustle of a scavenging bird hopping across the ground above, sounds of life that were both a comfort and a torture, proof that the world was still turning, that he was not the last soul left in a dead universe, but also that he was utterly and completely forgotten beneath it. His right arm, pinned awkwardly beneath him, began to scream with a new kind of pain, a sharp, fiery pins and needles sensation that was somehow a gift, a sign that the nerves were still alive, and he focused all his will, all his remaining strength, on a single, monumental task, to move the fingers of his right hand, which were curled against his chest, and after what felt like an eternity of straining, a lifetime of mental effort, he felt a faint, twitching response, a tiny spark of movement. In his index finger, a victory so small and yet so immense that it brought hot, silent tears to his eyes, tears that cut clean tracks through the grime on his face. This small movement was the key that unlocked a desperate plan, a plan born of a sheer, stubborn will to live that now burned brighter than his fear, and he began to work, slowly, infinitesimally, moving that single finger, rubbing it back and forth against the rough fabric of his own jacket, feeling for the familiar shape of the haversack that he had shoved the journal and the packet into, the objects that had somehow, impossibly, become his anchor to the man he was before the explosion, and, after what could have been minutes or hours, his raw fingertip found the coarse canvas strap, confirming the bag was still there, still pressed against his side, a tangible piece of evidence that his previous life had not been a fever dream. With agonizing slowness, each movement a Herculean effort that drained his precious air and sent fresh waves of pain through his crushed body, he worked his hand, millimeter by millimeter, into the haversack's opening, his breath catching in his throat as his fingers brushed against the smooth, cool surface of the oilcloth packet, and he hesitated for a moment, a superstitious fear gripping him. A feeling that this object was tied to his fate, before his determination hardened and he managed to hook a finger around the tight cord that bound it, and with a final, grinding effort, he pulled the heavy, rectangular packet free from the bag, bringing it up through the loosened soil until it was pressed against his chest in the tiny space he had carved with his stillness. He did not know what was inside, whether it would be useless to him or a final curse, but it was solid, it was real, and in a world of crushing softness and decay, it was the only tool he had, and so, with a hope that felt like a prayer, he began to use the hard, sharp corner of the sealed packet to scrape and dig at the damp earth near his face, scratching feebly at the wall of his prison. Each tiny scratch a declaration that he was still here, that he was still fighting, the sound of his own struggle the loudest thing in the silent, dark world beneath Gettysburg. The act of scraping, of moving, of doing anything at all in that absolute confinement became his entire universe, a tiny, desperate rebellion against the immense, silent weight that sought to hold him forever, each small, grating sound of the oilcloth packet's corner scratching against the packed soil a symphony of defiance that echoed louder than any cannon blast in the private darkness of his tomb, a sound that was his only proof he hadn't gone completely deaf or mad, a rhythm to which he now anchored his entire existence, focusing on nothing else but the slow, painful back-and-forth motion of his wrist, the muscles screaming in protest at the unnatural, limited movement, the rough texture of the dirt grating against the skin of his knuckles until he felt a warm, slick wetness that he knew was his own blood mixing with the cold mud. But the pain was a welcome feeling, a sensation that was purely and utterly his, a sign of life in a place of death, and he used it, embraced it, let it fuel his determination to keep going, to keep scraping, even as his mind began to wander again, drifting into a hazy space between delirium and determination, where the faces of his family would appear in the blackness, his mother's worried eyes, his father's strong hand on his shoulder, the laughing face of his younger sister. Memories that were now as sharp and painful as the rock digging into his back, and he fought for them, he scraped for them, each grain of dirt moved a step closer to a world that contained them again. The oilcloth packet was a mystery, a hard, unyielding rectangle that was both his tool and his torment, its contents unknown but its presence a constant, solid reminder of the strange twist of fate that had led him to this exact point, and he found himself wondering about the man who had owned it, the Confederate officer whose face he had never seen, whose name he did not know, but whose possessions were now the only thing standing between Samuel and a slow, suffocating end, a bizarre connection forged between enemies by the random cruelty of war, and in his feverish state, he began to feel as if he were digging not just for himself, but for that unknown soldier too, as if completing some unfinished task the man had left behind. The air in his tiny pocket was growing fouler, thicker, each breath a struggle that burned his lungs and left him feeling lightheaded, the oxygen slowly being replaced by the toxic gases of decay seeping from the bodies around him, a sweet, cloying smell that promised a sleep from which he would never wake, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that his time was running out, that the slow, meticulous scraping would not be enough to free him, that he needed a change, a risk, a final all-or-nothing effort. Gathering every ounce of strength he had left in his battered body, a strength born of pure, undiluted terror and a love for a sunlight he could barely remember, he shifted his weight as much as the crushing pressure would allow, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pains that shot through his ribs and back, and he changed the angle of the packet, no longer scraping sideways but now driving the sharpest corner upward, toward where he prayed the surface was. And he began to stab, to punch, to drive the package upward with short, jarring thrusts that sent vibrations through his entire frame, dislodging small showers of dirt that fell into his mouth and eyes, each thrust a silent, guttural cry of effort, a wordless scream into the earth, the hard edge of the packet hitting something solid, a root, a rock, and jarring his arm painfully. But he did not stop, he could not stop, for stopping was death. And so he punched again, and again, and again, the rhythm becoming frantic, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps that used up his precious air, until on one final, desperate upward thrust, he felt a sudden, shocking give, a crumbling of resistance, and a miraculous, impossible trickle of loose, dry soil rained down onto his face, followed by a single, blinding, beautiful sliver of cold, fresh air that cut through the stifling foulness of the grave like a knife. A sensation so shocking and wonderful that he froze for a second, unable to process it, before a desperate, choking sob escaped his lips and he thrust the packet upward again, twisting it, widening the hole, feeling more dirt fall away, And then, the most beautiful thing he had ever felt, the warmth of the sun on his bleeding fingertips as they broke through into the open air of a world he thought he had lost forever. He had done it. He had reached the surface. But the effort had cost him everything, and as the wave of exhaustion and pain and overwhelming emotion crashed over him, his body finally gave out, the packet slipping from his numb fingers, his arm falling limp, his consciousness retreating back into the blackness. But this time, it was a different darkness, one filled not with the silence of the grave, but with the distant sound of a bird singing somewhere above him, and the faint, sweet smell of fresh grass, and the glorious, cool kiss of free air on his skin. He was still buried, still trapped, but now he had a hole to the sky, a tiny, breathing tube of hope, and as he passed out, the word repeating in his mind was no longer a prayer, but a promise, alive. The faint, dusty scent of twilight air was the most profound luxury he had ever experienced, a stark, beautiful contrast to the cloying, suffocating stench of decay that had been his world for what felt like an eternity. And he lay there for a long, timeless moment, his cheek pressed against the cool, rough soil of the gully's edge, his body still mostly trapped in its earthy prison, doing nothing but breathing, each inhalation a deep, shuddering gasp that tasted of freedom and each exhalation a silent prayer of thanks, his mind too overwhelmed by the simple, miraculous act of drawing unrestricted breath to form a coherent thought, existing purely in the sensation of clean air filling his lungs and the weak, dying warmth of the sun on the back of his neck. Slowly, as the initial shock of his partial freedom began to subside, it was replaced by a cacophony of pain that announced the return of full feeling to his battered body, a deep, throbbing ache in his skull where it had struck the rock, a sharp, stabbing agony in his ribs with every breath that suggested one or more might be cracked, a fiery, raw pain in the fingers of his right hand where the skin had been worn away by his frantic scraping, and a pervasive, bone-deep cold that had seeped into his very marrow from the damp earth and the cold embrace of the dead, a symphony of misery that was, paradoxically, exhilarating because it was a sensation of life, a confirmation that he had survived the unsurvivable. Summoning a willpower he did not know he possessed, he pushed past the pain and began the Herculean task of freeing the rest of his body, using his one free arm to dig and claw at the dense, heavy soil that pinned his legs and torso, the process agonizingly slow, each handful of dirt a small victory, each rock dislodged a major obstacle overcome, his progress measured in fractions of an inch. The weight of the world seeming to conspire to keep him trapped, the tangled remains of the other soldiers acting as macabre anchors holding him fast. The sun continued its inexorable descent, the golden light fading into a deep orange, and then a bloody red, and with the fading light came a new, primal fear, the fear of the coming darkness, of being alone in this vast graveyard at night, exposed and helpless, and this fear lent a new, desperate strength to his efforts, his movements becoming more frantic, his breathing more ragged as he fought against time itself. With a final, guttural cry of effort that tore from his raw throat, he managed to get his knees under him and, leveraging against the side of the gully, he hauled his lower body out of the earth in a sudden, sickening lurch, collapsing forward onto his hands and knees on the open ground, free, completely free, for the first time in days, his entire body trembling with the effort. Strings of saliva and mud dripping from his mouth as he gasped for air, the feeling of open space around him both liberating and terrifyingly vast. He stayed on all fours for several minutes, head hanging down, waiting for the world to stop spinning, before he finally, slowly, and painfully pushed himself up into a sitting position, his muscles screaming in protest, and he looked around, truly seeing his surroundings for the first time since the explosion, and the sight that met his eyes would be seared into his memory forever. The battlefield of Gettysburg under the setting sun was a landscape of utter desolation, a silent, haunted world where the shadows were long and deep, stretching from the countless wooden stakes that marked the temporary graves of the fallen, a forest of the dead that covered the fields as far as his eyes could see, the once green grass now trampled and stained, the fences splintered and broken, the trees scarred and shredded by shot and shell. And there was not a single living soul in sight. No movement save for the gentle sway of tall grass in the evening breeze and the fluttering of a torn piece of cloth on a distant stake, a profound, crushing silence that was heavier and more oppressive than the noise of battle had ever been. He was alone, more alone than he had ever thought possible, a single, tiny, insignificant speck of life in a vast ocean of death, and the immensity of his isolation threatened to overwhelm the fragile courage that had gotten him this far, a deep, aching loneliness that was a colder prison than the earth had been. Shivering, not just from the cold but from the sheer terror of his situation, he remembered the haversack, the journal, the packet, his only links to something beyond this moment, and with stiff, painful fingers, he reached down into the hole he had just escaped, and, after a moment of fumbling in the loose soil, his hand closed around the familiar coarse canvas strap, and he pulled the bag free. Clutching it to his chest like a life preserver, a tangible piece of evidence that his previous life had been real. The light was failing fast, the stars beginning to prickle in the deep violet of the eastern sky, and he knew he had to move, to find shelter, to find water. But his body was at its absolute limit, and the thought of traversing this field of graves in the dark was more than he could bear, so he made a decision: he would not move tonight. Using the last of his strength, he crawled a few feet away from the edge of the gully, away from the horror of his own grave, and found a small, shallow depression in the lee of a shattered tree stump that offered a meager semblance of shelter and concealment, and there he curled into a tight ball, pulling his damp, filthy jacket tighter around himself, the haversack held tightly under his arm, as the darkness closed in completely, enveloping the world and leaving him alone with the ghosts of Gettysburg, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and the frantic, terrified beating of his own heart. The night was an endless, living entity that pressed in on him from all sides, a blanket of absolute blackness so complete he could not see his own hand trembling in front of his face. A darkness that was not merely an absence of light but a physical presence filled with sounds that seemed amplified and distorted by his terror and isolation. The rustle of the wind through the tall, blood-fed grass took on the whispering quality of voices just on the edge of hearing, murmuring secrets and lamentations in a language he could almost understand. The sudden, sharp crack of a cooling tree limb somewhere in the distance echoed like a far-off rifle shot that made his heart leap into his throat and his body tense for an impact that never came. And the soft, scuttling sounds of the field's true owners, the rats and other scavengers, returning to their grisly work in the darkness, their tiny, skittering footsteps moving through the dead leaves and soil all around him, sometimes coming so close he could hear their sniffing and squeaking, a sound that filled him with a primal revulsion and a fear that one might mistake his still, huddled form for just another part of the feast laid out across the landscape, a thought that kept him frozen in a rigid, petrified state, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly for fear of attracting their attention. The cold seeped up from the ground and down from the star-filled sky, a deep, damp chill that penetrated his thin, torn, mud-caked uniform and settled into his bones, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably and sending violent, racking shivers through his entire frame, a cold that was a tangible enemy, slowly and methodically sapping what little strength he had managed to reclaim, leeching the warmth and life from him hour by agonizing hour, and he curled himself into an even tighter ball, pulling his knees to his chest and tucking his head down, trying to preserve any shred of body heat, a futile effort against the relentless advance of the night's frigid grip. Sleep was an impossible luxury, a cliff he dared not approach for fear that if he let his guard down, if he surrendered to the exhaustion that pulled at every fiber of his being, he would simply never wake up, that his heart would slow and stop in the cold, and he would become a permanent part of this field, just another unknown body for some future detail to find and bury in a pit. So he fought against it with every ounce of his will, focusing on the pain in his ribs to keep himself alert, reciting the names of his family members over and over in his mind like a mantra, clinging to the memory of his mother's face, his father's voice, his sister's laughter, using them as a shield against the despair that threatened to swallow him whole. It was during the deepest, coldest part of the night, the hour when hope feels like a distant, foolish dream, that a new sound joined the nocturnal chorus, one that froze the blood in his veins more completely than the temperature ever could, the low, mournful, and unmistakable howl of a wolf, answered a moment later by another, and then another, a chorus of hungry cries that seemed to come from multiple directions, echoing across the silent, open land, a sound of pure, untamed wildness and primal hunger that spoke directly to the most ancient parts of his brain, triggering a fear deeper than the fear of cannon fire or burial, the fear of being hunted. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the scavengers were no longer just the small, skittering kind, that larger, more dangerous predators had been drawn by the immense scent of death, and that he, alone, wounded, and helpless creature, was now a potential piece of prey in their territory. He held his breath, listening, his entire body rigid with terror, every sense screamingly alert, waiting for the sound of a footfall, the glimpse of a shadowy form moving through the gloom. But the howls did not come again, though the memory of them hung in the air, a lingering threat that made the rest of the night an endless exercise in terrified anticipation, each rustle of grass now a potential stalker, each shift of shadow a possible lean, gray shape moving in for the kill. It was this sheer, unadulterated terror that finally kept him awake and alive through the seemingly endless darkness, his hand clenched so tightly around a rock he had grabbed for defense that his knuckles ached, his eyes straining against the blackness until they watered, his ears ringing from the effort of listening for a threat that might or might not be coming, a vigil that felt like it lasted a lifetime. Finally, after an eternity of this cold, fear-soaked darkness, a faint, barely perceptible light began to bleed into the eastern sky, a gradual, gentle lightening from absolute black to a deep, somber gray, revealing the silhouettes of the countless wooden stakes against the horizon. And with this slow return of the world, the nocturnal sounds began to fade away, the whispers in the wind falling silent, the scuttling noises retreating to their hidden dens, the oppressive, hunting presence of the night receding before the advance of the dawn. As the gray light grew stronger, allowing him to see the torn ground around him, the weight of the night's terror began to lift, replaced by a grim, determined clarity. He had survived the burial, he had survived the cold, and he had survived the wolves. He would not die here. With muscles that were stiff and screaming in protest, feeling older than the hills around him, he slowly, painfully uncurled himself from his defensive ball and pushed himself up to a sitting position, his body one solid ache, his mouth so dry his tongue felt like it was glued in place, and he looked out at the battlefield now revealed in the grim, gray light of dawn, a landscape of unimaginable loss and sorrow. And he knew his first mission, the thing that would keep him moving, was as simple as it was urgent. He had to find water, or the freedom he had fought so hard for would be stolen from him by thirst within a matter of hours. The profound, suffocating blackness of the night was a tangible prison, a void so absolute it erased the world and left only sensation, the relentless, deep cold that seeped from the churned earth into his very bones, triggering violent, uncontrollable shivers that sent fresh jolts of pain through his cracked ribs with every convulsion, a pain he clung to as an anchor against the seductive pull of unconsciousness, the symphony of terrifying sounds that filled the oppressive silence. The mournful sigh of the wind through the grass became a chorus of ghostly whispers speaking just beyond comprehension. The distant, sharp crack of a cooling branch echoed like a sniper's shot, freezing the blood in his veins, and worst of all, the soft, skittering rustles of the field's true inhabitants. The rats and other scavengers, their tiny, scratching footsteps, moving through the dry grass and soil all around his shallow depression, sometimes coming so agonizingly close he could hear their sniffing and squeaking, a sound that filled him with a primal, gut-wrenching dread that they might investigate the heat of his living body, a thought that kept him frozen in petrified, breathless tension for hours on end. The cold was a patient, insidious enemy, a slow creeping numbness leeching the strength from his limbs, threatening to pull him into a final, fatal sleep, and to fight it, he focused on the mental image of the woman from the daguerreotype, her calm, solemn face a talisman against the despair, a single point of light in the infinite dark, a reminder of a world beyond this field of death. Then, a new sound sliced through the darkness, striking a chord of primordial fear deeper than any other, the long, low, hauntingly mournful howl of a wolf, answered instantly by another from a different direction, and then another, a chilling chorus of raw hunger echoing across the open, corpse-strewn landscape, a clear announcement that large predators had arrived, and he knew, with a cold certainty, that he was no longer just a survivor but potential prey, a wounded animal alone in their territory. The remainder of the night was a rigid, silent vigil of pure terror, his hand clenched around a heavy rock, his ears straining for the slightest footfall, his imagination conjuring slinking gray forms in every shadow, and it was this sheer, adrenaline-fueled fear that kept him awake and alive. When a faint, gray light finally began to soften the eastern horizon, the terrifying sounds of the night receded, and the world returned to view, revealing the grim landscape of stakes and torn earth. With the dawn, the gripping fear was replaced by an even more immediate and pressing agony. A thirst so powerful his throat felt packed with hot, dry sand, each swallow a painful, grating impossibility. His lips cracked and parched. He knew his first and only mission was to find water. With muscles screaming in protest, he slowly, painfully uncurled, using his arms to push himself upright against the shattered tree stump, his head swimming dizzily. Leaning heavily, his legs buckling, he managed to stand, swaying unsteadily, the world tilting around him. He took his first, staggering step away from the gully, a lone, wounded figure beginning a desperate pilgrimage for water. His progress was agonizingly slow, a stumbling, shuffling gait across the torn and treacherous ground, every step a monumental effort that drained his precious reserves, his vision blurring and spotting at the edges, the vast, empty field seeming to stretch on forever under the bleak gray sky. He scanned the landscape desperately, his eyes searching for any sign of a low area, for the telltale green of vegetation that might indicate a water source, but saw only the endless, repeating pattern of wooden stakes and churned mud. The thirst was a raging fire in his chest, a constant, screaming demand that overshadowed all other pain and fear, a relentless driver pushing his broken body forward when every instinct begged him to collapse. He stumbled over a hidden divot and fell hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs and sending a white-hot flash of pain through his side. For a long moment, he lay there, face down in the dirt, the temptation to just give up, to let the field finally claim him, washing over him in a powerful wave. But the memory of the darkness, of the howls, of the crushing weight of the earth, flashed in his mind, and with a guttural, rasping groan, he pushed himself back onto his hands and knees, and then, with a Herculean effort, back onto his feet, his determination hardened into a brittle, unyielding resolve. He would not die here. He would find water. He would live. And so he continued his slow, torturous journey, each step a victory, each meter gained a testament to a will to survive that had been forged in the deepest darkness beneath Gettysburg. The world had shrunk to a tiny, agonizing point of existence defined solely by the cracked, barren desert of his throat, a burning, screaming need for moisture that overshadowed every other agony, the throbbing in his skull, the sharp, stabbing protest of his ribs, the raw, bloody state of his hands. All of it was secondary to the all-consuming fire of a thirst so profound it felt like his very soul was withering into dust inside him. He moved in a shambling, jerky half-walk, half-crawl, his body swaying dangerously with each step, his vision blurred and swimming with dark spots that danced at the edges, the vast, empty landscape of Gettysburg seeming to stretch out before him in a cruel, endless illusion, a taunting panorama of wooden grave markers and churned earth that offered no solace, no promise of relief, only the silent, grim testimony of death on an unimaginable scale. He fell, frequently, his legs simply giving out beneath him without warning, each impact with the hard, unforgiving ground sending fresh jolts of white-hot pain through his battered frame, and each time, the effort to rise again became more Herculean, the temptation to simply lie where he had fallen and let the overwhelming exhaustion claim him growing stronger, a seductive whisper in his mind promising an end to the suffering, a peaceful surrender to the inevitable. But something, some stubborn, unkillable spark deep within his core, forged in the absolute blackness of his earthly tomb and tempered by the howling terror of the night, refused to be extinguished. It was a wordless, primal drive to live, to see the sun again, to feel the wind on his face, and it was this alone that forced his trembling arms to push his body upright once more, that commanded his bleeding hands to claw at the dirt for purchase, that compelled his shattered will to focus on the simple, monumental task of moving one more foot, and then one more. His progress was achingly slow, a pathetic, stumbling pilgrimage across a field of nightmares, his eyes scanning the ground ahead with a desperate, frantic intensity, not for enemy soldiers or for shelter, but for any sign, any glint, any hint of water, a discarded canteen, a rain-filled hoofprint, the faint depression of a stream bed. But he saw only more of the same, torn fabric, broken equipment, and the endless, solemn rows of stakes. The thirst was a raging animal inside him now, clawing at his sanity, making his head pound with a deafening rhythm, and he began to hallucinate, seeing shimmering, beautiful mirages of clear, cool streams flowing just ahead, only to have them vanish into the bleak reality of mud and death as he stumbled toward them, a cruel trick of his desperate mind that left him sobbing dry, tearless sobs of frustration. He was on the verge of complete collapse, his body literally shutting down from dehydration, his thoughts becoming disjointed and strange, when his foot caught on a half-buried root and he pitched forward, landing not on hard ground, but with a soft, muddy splash into a shallow, water-filled ditch that he had been too blind with thirst to even see. The shock of the cold, wet impact was electric. With a frantic, animalistic energy he didn't know he possessed, he rolled onto his side and plunged his entire face into the murky, stagnant water, drinking in huge, desperate gulps, not caring about the taste of mud and algae and something else metallic and unpleasant, caring only about the glorious, life-giving wetness flooding his mouth, cooling his ravaged throat, and quenching the inferno within him. He drank until his stomach ached and he could drink no more, then he lay on his back in the shallow ditch, the muddy water soaking into his uniform, gasping for air, feeling the water coursing through his body, reviving his cells, clearing the fog from his mind, and bringing the world back into a sharp, stunning clarity. He was alive. He had found water. The immediate, mortal crisis had passed. But as he lay there, panting and grateful in the mud, the sound that reached his ears was not the silence of the field, but the distinct, distant, and unmistakable creak of a wagon wheel, and the low murmur of human voices getting steadily closer. The world had dissolved into a single, burning, all-consuming need, a raging thirst that eclipsed every other sensation. A fire in his throat and chest so intense it felt as if he had swallowed the sun itself, his tongue a swollen, useless piece of leather stuck to the roof of a mouth that was as dry and barren as the dust of a long-forgotten tomb, each ragged, panting breath he dragged into his lungs scraping like shards of glass, a painful reminder of the life that was slowly, inexorably, leaching out of him with every passing moment he spent under the vast, indifferent gray sky of this field of death. His body, a broken and battered vessel of pain, moved forward not through strength or will, but through a kind of desperate, autonomic persistence, a shambling, stumbling, lurching gait that carried him across the torn and treacherous earth, his feet catching on hidden divots and the scattered detritus of battle, a shattered musket stock, a torn knapsack, the stiff, leathery sole of a discarded boot, each misstep sending fresh, jolting waves of agony through his cracked ribs and up his spine, his vision blurred and swimming with dark, floating spots that coalesced into terrifyingly vivid hallucinations of cool, clear streams and overflowing canteens that shimmered tantalizingly just beyond his reach, only to vanish into the bleak, unforgiving reality of more mud, more stakes, more death as he staggered toward them, his heart cracking a little more each time the beautiful illusion dissolved. He fell, again and again, his knees buckling without warning, his body slamming into the hard, cold ground with a force that knocked the air from his lungs and left him gasping and weeping dry, tearless sobs of utter frustration and despair, and each time, the siren song of surrender grew louder, whispering to him of the peace that would come if he just stopped fighting, if he just closed his eyes and let the immense exhaustion finally claim him, offering a release from the agony, the thirst, the soul-crushing loneliness of being the only living soul in a landscape dedicated entirely to the dead. But something, some deep, stubborn, unkillable ember of life that had survived the crushing weight of the earth and the hunting cries of the night, refused to be snuffed out. It was a primal, wordless instinct, a drive more powerful than reason, and it was this alone that forced his trembling, bloodied arms to push his broken frame upright once more, that commanded his raw, shredded fingers to claw at the dirt for purchase, that compelled his shattered will to focus on the monumental, seemingly impossible task of placing one foot in front of the other, again and again, a slow, torturous pilgrimage across an endless expanse of sorrow. His mind, unmoored from time and reason, began to drift, flashing with fragmented, feverish images, the warm, sweet smell of baking bread in his mother's kitchen, the feeling of cool grass under his bare feet on a summer morning, the sound of his sister's laughter echoing across a sun-drenched meadow, memories of a life that felt like a dream belonging to another person, a world away from the cold, gritty reality of the mud caking his face and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He was on the very brink of complete and total collapse, his body beginning to shut down, his thoughts slowing to a thick, syrupy sludge, when his foot caught on a thick, half-buried root hidden beneath a tattered piece of gray cloth, and he pitched forward, his arms too weak to break his fall, and landed not on hard ground, but with a sudden, shocking, soft splash into a shallow, water-filled ditch that his desperate, thirst-maddened eyes had completely failed to see. The impact was a cold, electric shock to his system. A guttural, animalistic sound of pure need ripped from his ravaged throat as he rolled onto his side and plunged his entire face into the murky, stagnant water, drinking in huge, desperate, frantic gulps, not caring about the taste of mud and rotting vegetation and the faint, coppery tang of something else he didn't want to identify, caring only about the glorious, life-giving, miraculous wetness that was flooding his mouth, cooling his burning throat, and quenching the inferno that had been consuming him from the inside out. He drank until his stomach was distended and aching, until he thought he might be sick, and then he drank a little more, finally collapsing onto his back in the shallow, muddy water, his chest heaving, the cold wetness soaking through his uniform and chilling his skin. But he didn't care. He felt the water coursing through his veins, reviving his cells, washing the confusion from his mind, and bringing the world back into a stunning, sharp, and terrible clarity. He was alive. He had conquered thirst. The immediate, mortal crisis had passed, leaving him shivering and soaked, but fundamentally, undeniably revived. For a long time, he simply lay there in the ditch, staring up at the gray sky, listening to the sound of his own breathing, now easier and less painful, feeling a fragile, tentative sense of hope begin to bloom in his chest for the first time since the explosion. But as he lay there, grateful and exhausted, the sound that reached his ears, carried on the faint breeze, was not the silence of the field or the call of a distant bird, but the distinct, unmistakable, and terrifyingly mundane creak of a heavily laden wagon wheel, and the low murmur of human voices, growing steadily, inexorably closer. The sound was a physical blow, a jolt of pure, undiluted adrenaline that slammed into his chest with the force of a cannon shot, erasing in an instant the languid, grateful exhaustion that had settled over him in the muddy ditch, his body snapping from a state of relieved collapse to one of hyper-alert, heart-pounding tension, every sense straining to pinpoint the source and meaning of those sounds, the rhythmic, agonizingly slow creak of a wooden axle straining under a heavy load, the muffled thud of hooves on the soft, torn earth, and the low, grim murmur of men's voices, too distant to make out words, but carrying a tone of weary resolve that was unmistakably that of soldiers, or those tasked with the military's most horrible duties. A violent, conflicting storm of emotions erupted within him, a wild, soaring hope at the prospect of rescue, of human contact after the unimaginable isolation and horror of the past days, quickly followed by a cold, sinking dread that these were not rescuers, but a Confederate detail scavenging the field, or even worse, a Union burial party that would see him, covered head to toe in thick, drying mud and clutching a Confederate haversack, not as a survivor but as a scavenger himself, or worse, a deserter, and would treat him with the same grim, impersonal efficiency they afforded the dead. Frozen in the shallow water, he remained perfectly still, not even daring to breathe too loudly, his mind racing through the terrifyingly limited options available to him. Should he call out, reveal himself, and throw himself on their mercy, hoping their humanity would override their suspicion? Or should he stay hidden, silent, and let them pass, preserving his fragile safety but losing what might be his only chance at true salvation? The decision was torturous, each choice fraught with its own mortal peril, and as the sounds grew closer, the creaking of the wagon now accompanied by the snort of a horse and the clear clink of metal tools, the pressure of the moment became unbearable. Driven by an instinct deeper than reason, the same instinct that had made him bury himself in the dead to survive the shelling, he made his choice. He would hide. Moving with a painstaking slowness that made every muscle scream in protest, he pushed himself deeper into the muddy water of the ditch, squeezing himself down until only his nose and eyes remained above the murky surface, his body submerged in the shocking cold, and he pulled a handful of reeds and floating debris over his head, creating a pathetic but hopefully effective camouflage. His heart hammering against his ribs so violently he was certain the men approaching would be able to hear it. He lay there, utterly motionless, as the wagon finally came into view, a large, open-topped cart pulled by two weary-looking horses, its bed filled not with supplies, but with a stacked, tangled pile of naked, pale bodies, limbs stiff and awkwardly askew, a sight so horrifying and impersonal that it stole the breath from his lungs. This was not a burial detail, this was a cleanup crew, tasked with the ghastly, dehumanizing work of collecting the dead for mass burial, and the two men walking alongside it, their faces grim and hardened, were not soldiers but civilians, their clothes stained and their movements efficient and devoid of emotion. They stopped not 20 yards from his ditch, and one of them, a large man with a thick beard, lit a pipe, the smell of the tobacco smoke cutting through the stench of decay and reaching Samuel's nostrils, a bizarrely ordinary scent in the midst of such horror. "One more load from this sector ought to do it," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Then we can be shut of this godforsaken place." The other man, younger and thinner, nodded, kicking at a discarded canteen near his foot. "Just bodies now. All the good pickins are long gone," he replied, his tone suggesting a disappointment that turned Samuel's stomach. These were not saviors. They were ghouls, scavengers paid to collect the dead but who clearly also scavenged the valuables from the corpses, and the sight of the Confederate haversack next to Samuel in the ditch, now clearly visible, suddenly felt like a death sentence. If they found him, they would see the bag, assume he was a dead rebel, and likely rob him before unceremoniously tossing his living body onto their grisly pile. The younger man took a step toward the ditch, his eyes scanning the ground, and Samuel stopped breathing entirely, pressing himself deeper into the mud, praying to a God he had not spoken to in days to make him invisible, to turn him to stone, to do anything but let this man see him. The man's gaze passed over the reeds, hesitated for a terrifying second on the haversack, and then moved on. "Nothing here," he declared, turning back to the wagon. "Let's move on to the ridge." The bearded man grunted in agreement, and with a crack of the reins, the wagon began to move again, the terrible creaking and the sound of their voices slowly fading into the distance, leaving Samuel alone once more, shivering uncontrollably in the cold mud, not from the cold, but from the sheer, paralyzing terror of what had almost happened, and the devastating realization that his ordeal was far from over. That the world above ground was in its own way just as dangerous and just as cruel as the darkness he had escaped. The silence they left behind was not the empty silence of before, but a heavy, oppressive blanket of dread that seemed to press down on him from all sides, the fading creak of the wagon wheels and the distant murmur of the men's voices echoing in his mind like a haunting refrain, a chilling reminder that the world beyond his muddy ditch was not the safe, welcoming haven he had desperately hoped for, but a place of grim, utilitarian cruelty, where the living could be as terrifying as the dead, and where a man's life could be measured by the value of the belongings beside him. For a long, frozen time, he did not move, could not move, his body locked in a state of petrified tension, his ears straining for any hint of their return, his heart thrashing against his ribs like a wild bird trapped in a cage. The image of that wagon-load of pale, stiff bodies burned onto the back of his eyelids every time he blinked, a vision of a fate that had come horrifyingly close to claiming him, not through battle or thirst, but through the cold, impersonal efficiency of men who saw corpses as cargo. Slowly, painfully, the adrenaline that had flooded his system began to recede, leaving in its wake a deep, bone-rattling chill from the muddy water soaking his clothes and a fresh wave of agony from his injuries, which now announced themselves with a renewed vengeance, his ribs a tight band of fire around his chest, his head throbbing in time with his heartbeat, his raw hands stinging with the cold. With a groan that was more a gasp of effort, he pushed himself up into a sitting position, water and mud streaming from his hair and face, his body trembling uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the aftershock of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked down at the haversack, the source of his recent fear, lying half submerged in the murky water, and a new, complicated emotion twisted in his gut. This simple canvas bag, with its mysterious contents, was now a symbol of both his salvation and his potential doom, the journal and packet within it the only things that connected him to his identity, to the reason he had been in this field in the first place. Yet they also marked him, in the eyes of any who might find him, as an enemy, a scavenger, a thing to be disposed of. He could not abandon it, yet carrying it felt like carrying a target on his back. The practical need to move, to get out of the cold water and find some semblance of shelter before night fell again, forced him into action. Using the last dregs of his willpower, He dragged himself out of the ditch and onto solid ground, collapsing onto his hands and knees, vomiting a small amount of the stagnant water he had swallowed, his body convulsing with the effort. He was weak, colder than he had ever been, and utterly alone, but he was alive, and the encounter with the burial detail had given him one crucial piece of information. He was not safe here. This field was still being actively cleared, and to stay was to risk being found again, next time perhaps by someone less careless. He had to keep moving, to put distance between himself and this valley of death. But where could he go? The army was gone, retreated to wherever armies go after a battle. The town of Gettysburg was likely overflowing with wounded, a chaotic nightmare of surgeons and suffering. He had no map, no food, no idea which direction led to safety. His only plan, a pathetic and desperate one, was to head south, away from the worst of the carnage, and hope to find a farmhouse, a barn, some form of shelter where he could rest and recover without being discovered. The journey that followed was a blur of agony and determination. He walked for hours, his progress tortuously slow, stumbling through fields and woods, avoiding roads where he might be seen, his wet clothes chafing against his skin, his thirst returning with a lesser but still persistent nagging. The landscape began to slowly change, the grim markers of fresh graves becoming less frequent, the signs of battle fading, replaced by the untouched beauty of the Pennsylvania countryside, a contrast that felt almost mocking. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple, he saw it, a small, dilapidated barn, set back from a narrow dirt road, its roof sagging but its walls still standing. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. With the final dregs of his strength, he stumbled toward it, pushed open the heavy, creaking wooden door, and collapsed inside onto a floor of dusty hay, lying there in the dim, golden light filtering through the cracks in the walls, surrounded by the smells of old wood and dry hay. And for the first time since he had been blown into that gully, he felt a semblance of cover, of security. He was out of the open. He was hidden. Exhaustion claimed him instantly, pulling him down into a deep, dreamless sleep there on the barn floor, the haversack still clutched tightly in his arms, his body finally getting the rest it so desperately needed, while outside, the world continued to turn, unaware of the soldier who had returned from the dead. The barn was a cathedral of silence and dust, a sanctuary built from rough-hewn wood and the sweet, dry scent of old hay. And when he awoke, it was to a profound disorientation, the absolute blackness of the interior and the deep, aching stillness of his body making him wonder for a terrified moment if he had somehow been buried again, if his escape had been nothing but a final, cruel dream before the end. But then he felt the rough texture of hay beneath his fingertips, heard the soft scuttle of a mouse in the far corner, and saw the faint, gray light of pre-dawn seeping through the gaps in the wallboards, and the reality of his situation settled over him. He was alive, he was hidden, and he had survived the night in something resembling shelter. The pain was the next thing to announce itself, a symphony of misery conducted by the cold that had seeped deep into his bones during the night. His ribs were a cage of fire, his head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and every muscle in his body felt stiff and bruised, protesting loudly as he slowly, carefully pushed himself up into a sitting position, a task that required immense effort and left him breathless and dizzy. But beneath the pain, there was a new sensation, a fragile but undeniable flicker of strength that had not been there before, a result of the water he had consumed and the deep, uninterrupted sleep his body had finally been granted, a tiny reserve of energy that he knew he must use wisely. His first conscious thought was of thirst, a dry rasp in his throat that was a pale echo of the raging inferno from the previous day but still a pressing need, and his second was of the haversack, which he had clutched to his chest even in sleep. He pulled it onto his lap, his fingers, still raw and tender, fumbling with the buckle, driven by a need to understand the weight he carried. To know what mystery had been so important it had been buried with an officer and had then, indirectly, saved his own life. In the dim light, he opened the flap and carefully withdrew the oilcloth packet, its surface still slick and waxy, the cord that bound it tight and secure. With trembling hands he picked at the knot, his numb fingers clumsy and slow, until finally it gave way, and he was able to unfold the layers of protective cloth. Inside was not what he expected, not military dispatches or personal letters, but a thick, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with a simple, elegant design, and nestled beside it, a small, carefully wrapped porcelain doll, its painted face serene and its tiny dress finely crafted, a heartbreakingly personal treasure clearly intended for a child. The juxtaposition was so strange, so deeply human and out of place amidst the machinery of war, that it left him stunned, holding the objects in his hands as the first rays of the morning sun finally broke over the horizon, a single, brilliant beam of light piercing through a knothole in the wall and illuminating the doll's face, making it seem almost alive. This was no official secret. This was a father's final, desperate attempt to get a gift home to his daughter, a last piece of love carried into battle. The weight of it, the profound, simple humanity of it, crashed over him, and he understood in that moment that his mission had transformed. It was no longer just about his own survival. He had to get these things home. He had to find the man's family. The sound of a door slamming shut in the distance, far off but unmistakably human, shattered the moment. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat, clutching the doll and the book to his chest, listening intently. Voices, faint but clear, carried on the still morning air, not the grim tones of the burial detail, but the higher, brighter voices of children, followed by the low, weary voice of a woman. A farmhouse. He was near a farmhouse. Fear and hope warred within him. Should he reveal himself? Could he risk it? The memory of the men at the wagon was still fresh, a cold warning against trust. But the doll in his hand, a symbol of a love that transcended the divisions of war, gave him a fragile courage. He would not approach with his hands up, a soldier. He would approach with these gifts, a supplicant. He carefully rewrapped the treasures, placed them back in the haversack, and using a hanging timber for support, hauled himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He moved to the barn door and peered out through a crack. The world outside was washed in the clean, golden light of morning, and in the distance, across a field dotted with wildflowers, stood a small, simple farmhouse, smoke curling from its chimney. Taking a deep, painful breath, he pushed the door open and stepped out into the light, squinting against the sun, and began the long, slow, hobbling walk across the field toward the unknown, toward whatever fate awaited him, no longer just an escaped soldier, but a messenger. The walk across the wildflower-strewn field toward the distant farmhouse felt like the longest and most exposed journey of his life, each step a deliberate, painful act of will that sent fresh jolts of agony through his cracked ribs and made his legs tremble with a weakness that was both physical and spiritual, the bright, innocent sunlight that bathed the landscape feeling like a glaring, accusatory spotlight illuminating his every hobbling movement, his torn and mud-caked Union uniform, now faded and stained into a nondescript shade of brownish gray, hanging off his gaunt frame like a shroud, making him look less like a soldier and more like a scarecrow that had stumbled out of its field, a creature of straw and rags and desperation. He kept his eyes locked on the smoke curling from the farmhouse's chimney, a sign of life, of warmth, of normalcy that felt as distant and foreign to him as the memories of his own childhood, and he used that thin gray line against the sky as a guide rope, something to pull himself toward against the overwhelming urge to turn back, to hide in the dark safety of the barn, to avoid the terrifying uncertainty of human contact after so long alone with the dead. The haversack, now containing the profound weight of the Confederate officer's final gifts, felt impossibly heavy on his shoulder, a tangible burden of responsibility that was far greater than its physical weight, a constant reminder that this was no longer just about his own survival, that he was now the sole, fragile link between a dead man and his family, the guardian of a story that desperately needed to be told. As he drew closer, details of the farm emerged, a well with a wooden bucket beside it that made his parched throat ache with a fresh wave of thirst, a small vegetable garden struggling to grow in the summer heat, a few chickens pecking listlessly at the dirt near a rickety fence, and the sound of those children's voices again, clearer now, arguing playfully about some childish thing, a sound so normal, so utterly removed from the screams and moans that had been the soundtrack of his existence, that it brought hot, unexpected tears to his eyes, blurring his vision as he stumbled forward. He was within 100 yards of the porch when a door screeched open and a woman stepped out, her figure silhouetted against the dark interior of the house, a worn basket hooked over her arm, and she froze mid-step, her eyes widening as she saw the ragged, limping figure approaching her home, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of shock and fear. She was not old, but hardship had etched lines of weariness around her eyes and mouth, and her dress, though clean, was patched and faded, speaking of a life of struggle and scarcity. For a long, suspended moment, they simply stared at each other, the ragged soldier and the wary farm woman, a silent conversation of fear and need passing between them across the sun-drenched yard. Samuel knew he had to speak first, to shatter the tension before she could scream for a husband or a son who might appear with a shotgun. He stopped walking, holding his empty hands out in what he hoped was a gesture of peace. His voice, when it finally came, a dry, rasping croak that barely carried across the distance. "Please," he managed to force out, the words scraping his throat raw. "I mean no harm. I need water." The woman did not relax her defensive posture, her eyes scanning him, taking in the uniform, the gauntness of his face, the obviousness of his injuries, her gaze lingering on the haversack, and he could see the calculation in her eyes, the fear of a bluecoat, a Yankee, on her land, warring with the basic human decency he was appealing to. "State your business, soldier," she said, her voice firm but laced with a tremor of anxiety. "We've got nothing for the army here. We've given enough." It was then that he made his decision. He wouldn't plead his own case. He would show her his purpose. Moving slowly, telegraphing his every action, he slid the haversack from his shoulder, lowered it to the ground, and with trembling fingers, unbuckled it and carefully withdrew the oilcloth packet. He unwrapped it there in the dirt, the morning sun glinting off the fine porcelain of the doll's face and the elegant leather of the journal. He held them out, not as a soldier, but as a messenger. "I'm not here for me," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength from the conviction of his task. "I'm trying to get these home. They belong to a soldier, a Confederate officer. He didn't make it. I think he wanted his little girl to have this." The change in the woman's face was instantaneous and profound. The hard, defensive suspicion melted away, replaced by a look of stunned compassion, her eyes softening as she looked from the heartbreakingly innocent doll to the shattered man holding it. The war, the uniforms, the politics, it all fell away in that moment, stripped down to the simple, universal truth of a father's love and a lost child's gift. She let out a soft sigh, her shoulders slumping, and the basket slipped from her arm, forgotten. "Good Lord," she whispered, mostly to herself. She took a tentative step forward, then another, her fear replaced by a cautious, maternal concern. "You look like you've been to hell and back, son." Samuel could only nod, the simple kindness in her words almost undoing him completely. "Come," she said, her decision made. "Come up to the house. Let's get you that water." And as he took his first, stumbling step toward the porch, toward the promise of aid and a humanity he thought lost, he felt the heavy weight on his shoulders lighten just a little, the first small fragment of hope that his long, terrible journey might finally be nearing its end. The woman's name was Eliza, and her cautious compassion was a fragile lifeline thrown to him in the vast, lonely sea of his exhaustion. A single point of human connection in a world that had shown him nothing but brutality, decay, and the cold, utilitarian efficiency of the grave robbers, and as he followed her hobbling, pain-filled walk toward the promise of water and shelter, every step sending sharp, jarring pains through his body that made him grit his teeth and swallow back groans of agony, he felt a surreal disconnect, as if he were watching this scene play out from a great distance, seeing this ragged, limping specter of a man being led by this wary yet determined farm woman across a yard that was still dotted with the cheerful, bright yellow faces of wildflowers, a bizarrely peaceful setting that stood in stark, almost cruel contrast to the hellscape he had just traversed. She did not invite him into the main house. The risk was too great, she explained in a low, hurried voice, her eyes darting toward the distant dirt road that snaked past the edge of the property, a flicker of fear and pragmatism in her gaze. Her own husband was away, she said without offering details, and neighbors, though few and far between in this rural landscape, carried strong opinions and watchful eyes. A Union soldier, even one as shattered and broken as he, collapsing on her porch could attract unwanted attention, questions she couldn't answer, and the Confederate haversack he carried, if seen, could mean terrible trouble for her and her children. A brand of suspicion that could turn them into pariahs or worse in a community already by the war. Instead, she guided him, his arms slung over her surprisingly strong shoulders as she took on some of his weight, his stumbling, faltering steps slow and uncertain, to a small, low-built spring house nestled in a cool, shaded hollow behind the main property, a simple stone structure built over a natural, trickling spring where clay jars of milk and butter were kept cold in the shallow, continuously flowing water. The air inside was deliciously damp and cool and carried the rich, clean scent of wet stone, fresh earth, and damp wood, a stark, almost shocking contrast to the stifling, putrid air of the battlefield and the metallic taste of fear that had lived in his mouth for days. "You'll be safe here," she said, her voice echoing softly in the small, intimate space, her words a promise and a warning woven together. For a time. She left him there sitting on a rough-hewn wooden bench carved smooth by generations of use and returned minutes later with a staggering bounty that brought a fresh wave of tears to his eyes, a full, dripping oak bucket of clean, cold water from the deep well, a thick slice of coarse, dark brown bread that smelled wonderfully of yeast and grain, a small wedge of hard, sharp cheese, and a ragged but clean towel that had been patched in several places. She watched, her expression a complex mixture of deep pity, natural maternal instinct, and a lingering, understandable wariness, as he drank from the wooden dipper with a desperation that was almost shameful, the cold, pure water a blissful, shocking relief to his parched system, the bread and cheese tasting like a feast beyond compare, his body trembling not from cold now but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of this basic, human kindness. He slept again after she left, a deep, heavy, dreamless sleep of utter depletion on a pile of empty, musty grain sacks she had brought for him, the constant, gentle, rhythmic trickle of the spring a soothing, natural lullaby that washed away the echoes of cannon fire and the haunting whispers of the wind. When he awoke hours later, the light filtering through the cracks in the spring house door was the soft, liquid gold of late afternoon. Eliza was back, this time with her 2 children in tow, a boy of about 10, tall and lanky for his age with serious, watchful eyes that took in everything, and a younger girl, maybe 6 or 7, who peeked at him from behind her mother's worn skirts with wide, unblinking, curious eyes that held no fear, only the simple, frank wonder of the young. They brought more food, a bowl of hearty potato and leek soup, still warm from the pot and carrying the faint, comforting scent of thyme, and a single, perfect red apple. The children stared at his tattered, faded uniform, his gaunt, pale face now clean-shaven but etched with pain and exhaustion, with a frank curiosity that held no malice, only the simple, absorbing wonder of the young confronted with a living story. "This is Samuel," Eliza said to them, her voice gentle but firm, a tone that brooked no argument. "He is our guest, and he is resting. You will not speak of him to anyone. Not to your friends, not to the millers down the road, not to anyone. Do you understand?" They both nodded, their faces becoming solemn and wide-eyed, instantly captivated by the gravity and the secret they were now charged with keeping. Over the next 2 days, a fragile, silent routine developed, a quiet rhythm of survival and recovery. Eliza would appear at intervals, bringing simple, nourishing food and fresh water, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone. She brought a needle and sturdy thread and allowed him to sit in the sunlight by the spring house door and clumsily attempt repairs on his ravaged uniform, his raw, still painful fingers fumbling with the task, a small, mundane act that felt strangely therapeutic, a stitch towards normalcy. She left a straight razor, a small pot of soap, and a cracked, speckled mirror, and the act of scraping away the grime and the coarse beard from his face felt less like grooming and more like an archaeological excavation, the slow revelation of his own features beneath the dirt and blood, a strange and distant reunion with the man he used to be. Their conversations were hushed and practical, exchanges of necessity rather than camaraderie, but a deep, unspoken trust was built in the quiet moments. The profound, wordless gratitude in his eyes, the steady, unwavering kindness in hers, the way the little girl, whose name was Annie, began to leave small offerings for him, a pretty stone, a dandelion chain. Once a clumsily drawn picture of a house with smoke coming from the chimney. It was on the 3rd morning, as the first birds began to sing in the grey pre-dawn light, that he knew with a certainty that settled in his bones that he had to leave. He was stronger, the sharp, debilitating edge of his pain had dulled to a constant, bearable ache, and the risk of discovery for this woman and her children grew with every passing hour. He had unfolded the oilcloth bundle again, laying the journal and the porcelain doll on the bench beside him, the objects now feeling even heavier with the responsibility they carried. Eliza came just after sunrise, her basket holding a warm biscuit and a piece of fried ham. She saw the items laid out and then looked at his face, and she understood immediately. She didn't try to dissuade him. She simply nodded, her own face a mask of resigned sympathy. "The roads south are being watched," she said softly, handing him the food. "There are patrols. Both sides. They're looking for deserters, for stragglers, for spies." The word hung in the damp air between them, heavy and dangerous. She looked at the doll, her expression softening. "You can't travel as a soldier." Later that morning, she returned with a small bundle of clothes, a pair of her husband's old, worn trousers, a homespun shirt that was too big in the shoulders but would serve to conceal his frame, and a wide-brimmed straw hat. "It's not much," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, "but it might get you past a casual glance." As he changed out of the tattered remnants of his blue uniform, folding it with a surprising sense of reverence, and leaving it on the bench, he felt the final, symbolic severing from the army, from his identity as Private Samuel Weaver. He was now something else entirely. A man in borrowed clothes, carrying another man's secrets, walking into an uncertain future. Eliza provided one last, priceless gift: directions. She described back roads, creek beds to follow, landmarks to avoid. She told him of a town, a half-day's walk to the south, that might still have a functioning telegraph office, a tenuous thread to the wider world. As he stood at the edge of her property, the haversack now concealed under the homespun shirt, he turned to thank her, but words failed him. He simply looked at her, hoping his eyes could convey the depth of his gratitude for the water, the food, the shelter, but most of all, for the simple, restorative gift of human kindness that had brought him back from the brink. She offered a small, sad smile and pressed the last of the bread into his hand. "Go with God, Samuel," she whispered. And then he turned and walked away, not looking back, disappearing into the leafy green of the summer woods, a ghost once more, but now a ghost with a purpose. The woods swallowed him whole, a vast, green cathedral of dappled light and deep, shifting shadows that closed around him like a benevolent shroud, the dense canopy of oak and hickory overhead filtering the morning sun into 1,000 dancing golden coins that played upon the thick carpet of decaying leaves and soft moss underfoot, the air itself changing as he left the open fields behind, becoming rich and heavy with the humid scent of damp earth, of rotting wood, of living, growing things, a stark and welcome contrast to the metallic stench of blood and gunpowder that had been his world for so long that he had forgotten any other smell existed. He moved with a new, albeit still pained, caution, his senses, once dulled by exhaustion and agony, now sharpened by the potent combination of fear, purpose, and the rejuvenating effects of food, water, and rest, his ears straining to filter the natural symphony of the forest, the chatter of a squirrel scolding him from a high branch, the rustle of some unseen creature in the undergrowth, the distant, melodic call of a wood thrush, from any sound that was out of place, from the ominous jingle of harnesses, the crunch of booted feet on dry leaves, or the low murmur of men's voices that would signal the patrols Eliza had warned him about. The borrowed clothes felt strange against his skin, the rough homespun fabric of the shirt scratchy and unfamiliar, the trousers loose and hanging awkwardly on his gaunt frame, but they were also a disguise, a protective layer of anonymity that offered a psychological comfort as potent as the physical shelter the spring house had provided. He was no longer a soldier, an obvious participant in the grand, tragic conflict that had ravaged the land. He was simply a man, a traveler, a figure who could, with luck, blend into the background of a war-torn countryside, his terrible story hidden beneath the mundane exterior of a farmer's son. The haversack, now containing the precious, heartbreaking cargo of the doll and the journal, was a constant, reassuring weight against his back, a physical anchor to the mission that drove him forward, and he found himself constantly adjusting the strap, his fingers checking to ensure it was still there, a superstitious gesture to confirm that the purpose he had clung to in the darkness was still real, still tangible. He followed the path Eliza had described, not a proper road but a narrow, winding game trail that traced the course of a gurgling, shallow creek, the cool, clear water providing a guide and a source of replenishment for the canteen she had given him, filled with fresh, sweet water that tasted of life itself. The walking was still arduous, every step a conscious effort that sent dull throbs of pain from his healing ribs and a deep, muscular ache through his legs, but it was a clean pain, a pain of recovery and use, not the sharp, debilitating agony of injury, and he welcomed it as a sign that his body was slowly, stubbornly, knitting itself back together. Hours passed in this green, silent world, marked only by the slow movement of the sun across the small patches of sky visible through the leaves, and as he walked, his mind, freed from the immediate demands of survival, began to wander, to process the enormity of what he had endured, the images of the battlefield flashing behind his eyes with a new, terrible clarity. The face of the young boy who had stood next to him in the line just before the charge, his hands shaking as he tried to load his musket, the sound of the mini balls buzzing through the air like angry hornets, the sight of the color bearer going down, the flag staining red as it fell, memories he had suppressed now rising to the surface, demanding to be felt, and he walked with tears streaming silently down his face, not sobbing, just a steady, quiet release of grief and trauma that was as necessary as the water he drank. It was in this state of raw, emotional vulnerability that he heard it, the sound he had been dreading. It wasn't the distinct noise of a patrol, but something subtler, more insidious, the faint, rhythmic snap of twigs underfoot, a sound that was too regular, too purposeful, to be an animal. He froze instantly, his breath catching in his throat, his entire body tensing like a drawn bowstring, his heart hammering against his ribs. He melted into the shadow of a large, moss-covered fallen log, pressing himself flat against the damp, earthy-smelling wood, becoming utterly still, trying to make himself a part of the forest. The sounds grew closer, and then he saw them, 2 men, moving through the trees about 50 yards to his left. They weren't soldiers, not in uniform, but they moved with a wary, predatory grace that was deeply unsettling. They wore dirty, practical clothes and carried long rifles not of military issue, but older hunting pieces. Their faces were hard, pinched with a kind of desperate avarice, and they scanned the woods not with the alertness of hunters looking for game, but with the sharp, calculating eyes of men looking for opportunity, for loot, for anything of value left behind by the receding tides of the armies. Bushwhackers. Or just common thieves taking advantage of the chaos. They passed by, their low, muttered conversation just a rumble of sound without distinct words, and they didn't see him, their attention focused on the more open ground ahead. He remained frozen for a long time after they had disappeared from view, his body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline, the encounter a brutal reminder that the dangers of this world were not confined to battlefields and burial details, that the war had unleashed all manner of predators who stalked the edges of the conflict. It shook him to his core, stripping away the fragile sense of security the woods had provided. His progress after that was slower, more fearful, his eyes constantly scanning, his ears straining, every shadow now a potential threat, every sound a possible ambush. The weight of the haversack felt different now, not just a responsibility, but a potential death sentence, a treasure that men would kill for. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees, when the woods finally began to thin, and through a break in the foliage he saw it, a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley, a church spire, the lazy curl of smoke from a dozen chimneys. The town. Eliza's town. His destination. A new kind of anxiety, colder and sharper than the fear of bushwhackers, gripped him. This was the world of people, of questions, of suspicion. He stood at the tree line for a long time, watching, studying the pattern of the town, the few people moving slowly in the streets, looking for any sign of blue or gray uniforms, any indication of who controlled this place. He saw none. It seemed quiet, normal, but he knew that was an illusion. Taking a deep, steadying breath, adjusting the haversack one last time, he stepped out of the protective embrace of the forest and began the long, exposed walk down the grassy slope toward the edge of town, toward the unknown, his heart pounding not with the fear of death now, but with the terrifying prospect of hope, the transition from the deep, shadowed embrace of the forest to the open, sun-washed slope felt like stepping onto a stage under a blinding spotlight, every instinct screaming at him to retreat back into the protective anonymity of the trees, to remain a ghost in the greenwood rather than risk becoming a man again in the world of other men, a world that had shown him little but violence, suspicion, and a cold efficiency in dealing with the wounded and the lost. His footsteps, now on soft, untrampled grass, felt impossibly loud in his own ears, each one a declaration of his presence to anyone who might be watching from the windows of the scattered farmhouses on the outskirts of the town, his body humming with a nervous energy that made his hands tremble and his skin prickle with a cold sweat despite the warmth of the afternoon sun on his back. He kept his head down. The wide brim of the borrowed straw hat pulled low over his eyes, not just to shield his face from view but to narrow his world to the few feet of ground in front of him, to avoid making eye contact with any of the few figures he could see moving slowly in the distance along the town's main street. A woman carrying a basket, an old man sitting on a porch, a dog sleeping in a patch of dust, all scenes of such mundane, peaceful normality that they felt like paintings from a life he had once known but could no longer touch. A gallery of a world that was continuing on, oblivious to the fact that his own world had ended in a gully of mud and corpses just days before. The weight of the haversack against his back was a constant, pressing reminder of his purpose, the hard edges of the journal and the dull feeling like they were branding his skin through the homespun shirt, a secret that was both his reason for being and a potentially fatal liability in a place where allegiances were likely complex, frayed, and deeply felt, where the wrong word, the wrong question, could bring a world of trouble down upon him. He could feel the eyes on him now, the subtle, unseen weight of curiosity and suspicion from behind curtained windows, from the shaded depths of porches, the sensation of being assessed, categorized, and filed away by people who had learned to be wary of strangers, especially strangers who appeared from the direction of the recent fighting, looking as gaunt and hollow-eyed and battered as he knew he must look. A walking testament to the horror that had unfolded just a few miles away. He focused on Eliza's directions, replaying her soft, firm voice in his mind, using it as a guide rope through the rising tide of his panic. Follow the creek till it meets the road, then take the left fork. The town's not big. You'll see the blacksmith shop first, its chimneys crooked. The telegraph office is just past it, next to the dry goods store, has a blue door. He clung to these details, these mundane landmarks, as if they were sacred verses, each one a step closer to fulfilling his promise, to somehow making sense of the senseless violence he had endured by performing this one, small, human act of returning a dead man's treasures to his family. The road under his feet changed from dirt to the uneven, worn planks of a wooden sidewalk as he reached the first buildings, the sound of his footsteps changing from a soft crush to a hollow, echoing thump that seemed to announce his arrival with every step. The smells of the town washed over him, the tang of coal smoke from the blacksmith's forge, the sweet smell of hay from a livery stable, the faint, greasy aroma of cooking from a nearby house, all of it mixing into a potent cocktail of everyday life that was almost overwhelming after the stark simplicity of the forest and the battlefield. He saw the blacksmith's shop, just as she had described, the chimney leaning precariously to one side, and his heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against his bruised ribs. This was it. The blue door was just ahead, a splash of faded color on a building that also housed the dry goods store, its windows displaying a sparse collection of fabrics, tools, and tinned goods. He stopped for a moment, his breath catching, his courage faltering as he stared at that blue door, the final barrier between the nightmare of his recent past and the fragile hope of his mission. What would he say? How could he, a ragged stranger in borrowed clothes, possibly explain the story he carried? What if the telegraph operator was a staunch Union man who would see the Confederate journal and call for the sheriff? What if the lines were down? What if the address inside the journal led nowhere? 1,000 fears swarmed in his mind, threatening to paralyze him there on the sidewalk, to turn him around and send him fleeing back into the woods. But then he thought of the officer, the man he had never met, who had carried this doll into battle, who had probably died dreaming of the little girl who would never receive it. He thought of the weight of the earth on his chest, the absolute blackness, the howling of the wolves. He had not survived all of that to turn away now. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that sent a spike of pain through his side, he pushed the blue door open and stepped inside. The room was small, dark, and stuffy, smelling of dust and ozone and old paper. A single counter separated the small waiting area from the machinery of the telegraph itself, a complex-looking device with a brass key and a spool of wire. A man with a green eye shade and sleeve garters looked up from a ledger book, his expression one of bored annoyance until he got a proper look at the stranger who had just entered his establishment. His eyes widened slightly, taking in the ill-fitting clothes, the pale, strained face, the posture of someone holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone neutral, carefully devoid of any emotion that might commit him to a position. Samuel approached the counter, his mouth dry. He could feel the man's eyes on him, assessing, calculating. This was it. There was no going back. Slowly, carefully, he slid the haversack from his shoulder and placed it on the counter. He didn't open it. Not yet. He looked the telegraph operator directly in the eye, hoping the conviction he felt showed on his face. "I need to send a message," Samuel said, his voice low but clear, each word measured and deliberate. It's about a soldier's effects. I need to find his family." The operator's eyes flicked down to the haversack, then back to Samuel's face. The bored annoyance was gone, replaced by a sharp, keen interest. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Which army, son?" The operator's question. "Which army, son?" hung in the dusty, ozone-scented air of the small telegraph office like a suspended blade, its simple phrasing containing a universe of unspoken implications, potential dangers, and unguessable consequences, and for a heart-stopping moment, Samuel felt the fragile framework of his courage threaten to collapse entirely, his mind racing through a labyrinth of possible answers, each one leading down a different path that could end in acceptance, suspicion, or outright arrest. The man behind the counter, his face partially obscured by the green eye shade but his eyes sharp and unblinking, waited with a patient, unnerving stillness, his fingers resting lightly on the ledger book, and Samuel understood that this was the first test, the initial, crucial moment where his story would either be believed or dismissed, where his entire desperate journey would either find its purpose or meet its end in a small-town jail cell. He knew he could not lie. The evidence was in the bag, and a lie would be instantly transparent, marking him as a deceiver with something to hide. But the truth was a grenade with the pin pulled. He drew a slow, careful breath, willing his voice not to shake, and met the man's gaze. The other one, sir," he said, the words coming out in a low, measured tone that belied the frantic pounding of his heart. "A Confederate officer. He didn't make it off the field. I'm trying to get his personal things back to his family." He watched the operator's face closely, searching for any flicker of anger, of patriotic outrage, but saw none. Instead, the man's expression shifted from sharp assessment to something more complex, a deep, weary curiosity mingled with a hint of respect. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, and his shoulders relaxed a fraction. "I see," he said, his voice still low. "A noble aim, son. In times like these, it's a rare thing." He glanced toward the blue door, as if ensuring it was still closed, then back at Samuel. "But a dangerous one. You understand that? There are folks around here who wouldn't ask questions. They just see the gray." Samuel nodded, a wave of relief so potent it made him light-headed washing over him. "I understand, sir. That's why I came here. The woman, Eliza, at the farm by the creek, she said you might help. That you were a fair man." At the mention of Eliza's name, the operator's demeanor softened further. "Eliza Gable sent you?" He almost smiled. "She's a good woman. Cares for folks. All right then. Let's see what you have." With trembling fingers, his hands feeling thick and clumsy, Samuel unbuckled the haversack and carefully, almost reverently, withdrew the oilcloth packet. He laid it on the counter and slowly unfolded the layers, revealing the fine leather journal and the delicate porcelain doll with its serene, painted face. The operator leaned forward, his professional detachment falling away, replaced by a look of genuine awe and sadness. He reached out a finger but did not touch the doll, his hand hovering over it as if it were a holy relic. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, a profound sadness in his voice. "Carry this into the fight, did he? For his little girl." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of understanding, a recognition of the universal language of a parent's love that transcended the artificial boundaries of North and South. Samuel simply nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in his own throat. The operator looked from the doll to Samuel's face, his eyes taking in the gauntness, the shadows of unspeakable trauma, the determination that had somehow survived it all. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his tone now gentle, almost paternal. "Samuel Weaver, sir. Union, 1st Minnesota." The man nodded, filing the information away. "Well, Samuel Weaver of the 1st Minnesota, my name is Horace Higgins. And it appears we have a mission to undertake." He turned the journal over, examining it with a careful, practiced touch. "We'll need a name, an address, something to work with." He carefully undid the leather strap and opened the journal. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping handwriting, diary entries, thoughts, sketches of camp life. Horace's eyes scanned the pages quickly, efficiently, looking for a name, a location. Samuel watched, his breath held, the silence in the small office broken only by the soft rustle of pages. Finally, Horace's finger stopped halfway down a page. "Here," he said, his voice quiet with triumph. "Captain William Sterling, of Charleston, South Carolina." He looked up at Samuel, his eyes alight with purpose. "Charleston. A long way from here." He closed the journal with a soft thud. "Right. Let's see if we can get a message through. The lines have been patchy, and traffic is heavy with military dispatches, but we can try." He moved around the counter and sat down at the telegraph key. "I'll send it to the central office in Richmond. They have better directories, might be able to forward it to a local operator in Charleston, someone who can make inquiries." His fingers poised over the key. "What should the message say?" Samuel thought for a moment, the words forming slowly, carefully. "Tell them that Captain William Sterling of the Confederate Army fell at Gettysburg. That his personal effects were recovered. That they can be claimed by his family. And that he was thinking of his daughter at the end." Horace nodded, a look of deep respect in his eyes. "A fine message," he said softly. Then his fingers began to move, tapping out a rapid, staccato rhythm that filled the small room, a series of clicks and pauses that were utterly incomprehensible to Samuel but which represented his words, his promise, being converted into electrical impulses and sent racing down the wire. A tiny spark of hope traveling across a war-torn landscape toward a family who had no idea their world was about to change. He tapped for what felt like an eternity, then stopped, listening. After a moment, a series of clicks echoed back from the machine. Horace listened intently, then nodded to himself. "They acknowledge receipt. They'll try. No promises, but they'll try." He looked at Samuel, who was swaying on his feet, the immense emotional and physical toll of the last hour finally crashing down on him. "You look like you're about to fall over, son. You can't stay here. It's not safe." He thought for a moment, then made a decision. "There's a room upstairs. It's just a storage closet, but it has a lock on the inside. You can stay there tonight. No one will bother you. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Overwhelmed with a gratitude so deep it was beyond words, Samuel could only nod. The mission was not over, but the first, most impossible step had been taken. The message was sent. The world now knew that Captain William Sterling had not been forgotten. The room above the telegraph office was exactly as Horace Higgins had described, a narrow, dusty storage closet filled with the ghostly shapes of old furniture draped in yellowed sheets, stacks of ledgers from decades past that smelled of mildew and forgotten business, and a single, small window so thick with grime that it turned the fading evening light into a dull, golden haze. But to Samuel, after the cold mud of the ditch and the hard floor of the spring house, it felt like a palace, a secure, private sanctuary where the doors could be locked from the inside, where the sounds of the world were muffled to a distant murmur, and where, for the first time since the battle had begun, he felt something approximating safety. Horace had brought him a thin but clean straw tick and a rough wool blanket, along with a bowl of hearty stew and another chunk of the dense, dark bread, and the simple act of eating a warm meal without fear of discovery, of stretching his aching body out on a semi-soft surface, of listening to the reassuring sounds of Horace moving about downstairs, going about his business as a shield and a sentinel, was so profoundly comforting that it brought a pressure to his chest that was not pain, but something closer to grief, a release of tension so complete it left him feeling hollowed out and weightless. He slept then, not the fitful, terrified sleep of the past week, but a deep, dreamless, healing oblivion that claimed him the moment he closed his eyes, a sleep so absolute that when he awoke, disoriented and unsure of where he was, the gray light of dawn was already seeping through the dirty window, and he realized with a start that he had slept through the entire night without a single nightmare. A small miracle that felt like a sign of returning humanity. He lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the town coming to life below, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer striking iron, the rumble of a wagon on the plank road, the distant call of a farmer to his animals, and he allowed himself, for just a few moments, to imagine a life in such a place, a simple life of work and quiet, a life where the weight on his back was a sack of grain, not a dead man's secrets. But the fantasy was brief, shattered by the memory of the haversack, which he had placed carefully beside his pallet, and the face of Captain William Sterling, a man he had never known but whose final wishes had become the entire architecture of his own survival. The lock on the door clicked open, and Horace's cautious face appeared. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low rumble. He carried a basin of fresh water and a towel. "There's been no answer on the wire yet. Might take time. These things do." He set the basin down and looked at Samuel with a critical eye. "You can't stay cooped up in here forever, son. But you can't be seen downstairs either. Not with that." He nodded toward the haversack. "I have an idea. There's work that needs doing out back. The woodpile needs splitting. It's hard labor, but it's outside the rear door, hidden from the street by the privy and a thick hedge. It'll get you fresh air, work your muscles, and you'll look like any other hired man. It might do you good." The idea was both terrifying and appealing. The thought of being outside, of feeling the sun on his skin and using his body for a simple, honest task was a powerful lure. Nodding his agreement, he rose, his body still protesting but feeling stronger than the day before, the food and rest having worked their magic. The work was exactly as described, brutally hard. The axe felt foreign and impossibly heavy in his hands at first, each swing sending jarring vibrations through his healing ribs and making his raw palms sting. But he welcomed the pain, embraced it as a punishment and a purification, losing himself in the rhythm of the task, the lift, the swing, the satisfying crack as the log split, the scent of fresh-cut oak filling the air. He worked for hours, his shirt soon soaked with sweat, his muscles burning, but with each swing, he felt a little more of the battlefield's horror being sweat out of him, a little more of the grave's chill being burned away by the sun and his own exertion. He was so absorbed in the work, in the mindless, physical catharsis of it, that he didn't hear the approach of the two men until they were already through the gate in the hedge, standing there watching him. He froze, the axe held halfway through its arc, his heart leaping into his throat. They were not soldiers, but they had the look of officials, town constables, perhaps. Their faces were stern, their postures rigid with self-importance. The older one, a man with a thick gray mustache and cold eyes, spoke first. "You the new man Higgins hired?" he asked, his tone implying that he already knew the answer and found it suspicious. Samuel lowered the axe, his mind racing. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The man's eyes swept over him, taking in his ill-fitting clothes, his sweating, gaunt face, the raw blisters on his hands. "Don't recognize you. You from around here?" "No, sir," Samuel managed to croak out. "Just passing through. Looking for work." The second man, younger and leaner, took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Passing through from where, exactly?" "The fighting was up Gettysburg way. You come from that direction?" The air grew thick and heavy. Samuel could feel the weight of the haversack, seemingly glowing with guilt from its hiding place just inside the back door. He could lie, but a bad lie would be worse than the truth. He was formulating a response when the back door opened and Horace stepped out, his face a mask of calm geniality that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, Elias, Jacob," he said, nodding to the two men. "Something I can help you with. Checking on the new wood boy. He's a hard worker, I'll give him that. Stronger than he looks." The older man, Elias, turned his cold gaze on Horace. Just making inquiries, Horace. Strangers in town make folks nervous. Especially now. We heard a rumor. Someone thought they saw a man matching the description of a deserter from the 12th New Jersey coming through the woods yesterday. This fella here matched that description? The question hung in the air, a deadly trap. Samuel held his breath. Horace didn't even blink. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Deserter? This one? Elias, look at him. He's half-starved and can barely lift that axe. If he deserted, it was from a hospital, not a regiment. I found him sleeping in my woodpile this morning, begged for work in exchange for a meal. A pity case is all. He looked at Samuel with a feigned exasperation. Isn't that right, boy? Samuel seized the lifeline. Yes, sir, he said, ducking his head in a show of shame. Just needed a meal.